With a topic as timely and potentially serious as climate change, you'd think that the educational power and accessibility of modern mass media would be a clarifying, unifying force, and thus a reducer of controversy. But obviously that's not the case. The fragmentation of public opinion around the climate change issue has never been greater, which leads some to wonder if perhaps we're missing something. Naomi Klein is an award-winning journalist, best-selling book author, analyst, lecturer, filmmaker, and activist. She's written 2 widely acclaimed books, No Logo, which many consider the Bible of the anti-globalization movement, and The Shock Doctrine, which analyzes how political leaders use disasters, natural and contrived, to push through policies. Her new book is This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate, and like perhaps no other previous work, it attempts to go to the primal roots of the climate change issue. From the reception it has received so far, she may have succeeded. The book is over 500 pages long, with almost 100 pages of references, but its main points can seemingly be summarized with 10 key ideas. Here they are listed, and now we'll go through them one by one. The first crucial idea to be understood is that so far we are losing the climate war badly. It was 1988 when James Hansen first brought to the world stage the idea of global warming as a result of carbon buildup in the atmosphere. That was almost 3 decades ago, and for all the talk since then, we've got essentially nothing to show for it. Zilch. I'm talking here about effective, committed, binding public policy to significantly cut greenhouse gas emissions. So far it's been all talk, no action. What's going on? Why are we so inept? Klein's first chapter is aptly called The Right is Right, and it's one of the most important ideas in the book. It explains that right-wing groups are actually correct in their perception of how serious a threat climate change action is to free market ideology. It's the left-wing progressives trying to appease the right who seem to be confused about this. While everyone knows that Reagan and Bush stood for free market capitalism, many don't realize that essentially so did Clinton and Obama. Clinton brought in NAFTA, and Obama is now pushing for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We've now had 35 years of increasingly unregulated capitalism from which to judge its effectiveness. And what do we see? Trade agreements like NAFTA are proving to be disastrous for climate action, not to mention American jobs or Mexican farmers. We now have situations where countries trying to protect their environment can be sued by companies wanting to make a profit. The extractivist mindset is a symptom of hyper-individualism, hyper-materialism, and an outdated, non-sustainable, winner-take-all mentality. The fourth idea is the sobering realization that the fossil fuel industry is basically now out of control. Its wealth and political power are unprecedented. It has not only not scaled back in the face of the climate issue, it has dug in deeper and expanded on all fronts, all while maintaining the facade that they're committed to renewable energy. What they're obviously committed to is making as much money as possible for as long as possible, regardless of the climate consequences. One of the myths that the fossil fuel industry has perpetuated is that renewable energy is not yet ready for prime time and still off in the future. In other words, that it's still not ready to replace fossil fuels. Klein points to several credible studies showing just the opposite. Most notably was the work of Mark Jacobson at Stanford, outlining in detail how 100% transition to renewables could be readily achieved in just 20 years. Just as importantly, full transition to renewables could potentially be fully funded by a carbon tax where the revenues go directly to the new technology and infrastructure. Now, naturally, some conservatives won't like this, but for anyone able to actually look at the big picture, honestly and unselfishly, this is a tax that makes sense. Since the 1980s, there's been widespread buy-in to the idea that solutions have to be profitable to be viable. that we are complete slaves to market forces, and that the convenience of low cost trumps all other factors, no matter how serious the consequences. So one of the most important ideas in Klein's book is that this notion of always partnering green causes with profit-making has been for the most part a dismal failure. Simply put, green capitalism alone isn't happening fast enough to solve the climate issues. Those who believe strongly in green capitalism often hold out hope that, as a wild-card factor, the impulsive philanthropy of green billionaires could be the driving force for bold and innovative change. But so far, unfortunately, the track record has not borne this out. Some think that the challenge of collective international cooperation is hopeless, and that only radical techno-fixes will save us. Klein looks at various geoengineering schemes that essentially seek to block sunlight from reaching the Earth. One idea is to pump huge amounts of smoke into the atmosphere to mimic the effect of large volcanic eruptions like Mount Pinatubo, which actually did cool the planet for a couple of years. But aside from the fact that blue sky would become a thing of the past, the Murphy's Law risks here are off the charts. Just for starters, it was observed that following the Mount Pinatubo eruption were serious droughts. Klein's conclusion about geoengineering is that it's fundamentally misguided. Klein's overall conclusion that we need nothing less than a mass social movement is as radical as it is sobering. Those viewing the current fragmentation of public opinion can be justifiably skeptical, at least initially. But in the end, Klein is being realistic, and her view is simply testimony to A, the unprecedented seriousness and urgency of the climate problem, and B, the historical record of what types of things worked in the past to actually bring positive change. The last part of the book chronicles hopeful signs around the world on how such a momentous and economically transformative mass social movement could develop. Notably significant are some of the successful legal campaigns that have been recently mounted by indigenous peoples and localized groups on multiple fronts. Because of the ambition, scope, importance, and uncompromising nature of Klein's book, both praise and criticism has come from many quarters. Most of the praise has centered around Klein's courage to, in the mainstream mass media, call capitalism itself out on the table. So far, there are seemingly no serious rebuttals to this book. Perhaps it will take more time. Some reviewers did say they'd like to see a clearer picture of what Klein's mass social movement would actually look like. But since the work is already over 500 pages long, this would seem to be somebody else's job. Along those lines, there are some items that could be discussed to help in clarifying the vision promoted in this remarkable book. So here are 3 additional ideas for your consideration. Klein didn't use the R word, but maybe she should have. This is an electric word that Americans, for some reason, seem to be afraid of. Maybe it's our collective memory of the naive radicals in the 60s. We celebrate the Industrial Revolution and Computer Revolution, so we know that revolutions don't have to be violent. In any case, whatever you want to call it, it's time to get mentally prepared for a major historical tipping point. One prerequisite to this is that we stop being so cynical about human nature. Much scientific evidence is now coming in suggesting that people are in fact born with natural empathy as well as ability to know good from bad. Even potentially problematic natural traits like tribalism can be modified with education. The bottom line, if we assume that it's a dog-eat-dog world, it will be a dog-eat-dog world, but it doesn't have to be. We also need to get excited about the future again and stop indulging in negative dystopian themes and recognize what eminent sociologist Fred Pollock once said about our image of the future being, to some extent, a self-fulfilling prophecy. In other words, we need to get busy imagining positive scenarios for our collective future. The coming crisis is the opportunity. As the ice melts, the waters rise, the storms get worse, and the climate deniers shrink in number, the overall level of climate anxiety is only going to grow larger. This is our opportunity. We need to harness that human energy and channel it toward mobilization. The impact of huge numbers of people connected by the internet and working together on something could be like nothing seen before in history. This kind of energy can easily drive consumer choices, overall market forces, and public policy by politicians in a completely new and bright direction. On that note, the art and science of collaboration is a topic we need to get very serious about. It needs to be systematically taught in schools, and contrary to the negative views of human nature expressed in Garrett Hardin's famous work, The Tragedy of the Commons, we need to embrace the historical importance of human collaboration and take it to a new level. Finally, we come to the most important addendum to Klein's work, a sneak preview glimpse of what the results of our revolutionary mass social movement could look like. The time frame is 20 years. As crazy as it sounds, we seemingly need to do 3 basic things in that window of opportunity to successfully solve climate change. Here they are. We need to cut greenhouse gas emissions down to near zero. We need to cleanse the atmosphere of excess carbon. And we need to redistribute wealth on a global scale. Tall order? Yes. But maybe not quite all as bad as it sounds. Here are the specifics. The best candidate for cutting emissions seems to be solar energy plus hydrogen for storing and transporting that energy. In contrast to the lack of progress in climate change policy in the last 27 years, the technology for both solar and hydrogen has made huge bounds in that time span. Both are now ready for large-scale deployment. This basically means a solar panel on every roof and an electrolyzer for making hydrogen in every garage. With all safety and ease of use issues now solved, hydrogen, the most abundant element in the universe, becomes the new energy currency, replacing fossil fuel for all energy uses in all our buildings, large and small. With economies of scale, the cost for these technologies plummet. We also need zero-emission transportation. This means hydrogen cars, trucks, airplanes, boats, ships, scooters, and trains, especially trains. We need full-service hydrogen fuel cell railway systems to be the transportation workhorse of the 21st century. This will both A, cut emissions down to negligible levels, and B, make possible fully walkable cities. But even if we stop all carbon emissions tomorrow, there's already too much of it in the atmosphere now. We need to transfer large amounts of carbon back to the ground where it belongs. There are multiple ways to do this, both low-tech and high-tech. Either way, it will need to be on a massive scale. One of the most promising means is through the use of biochar, a type of charcoal that's easy to make that, by locking carbon into the soil, over time it essentially pulls CO2 from the atmosphere. The third and final factor for transition in the next 20 years involves a point already made by Klein, but now to be emphasized. It involves the sharing of wealth and means of production. The new technologies described above will not only be clean and green, they will be distributed, decentralized, and available to all. Both our infrastructure and means of production can no longer be controlled by an elite few. That phase of our history must now pass. A central part of this prerogative involves a worldwide social safety net that essentially eliminates abject poverty. While we don't necessarily need to throw out capitalism and/or individualism, what we do need is enlightened individualism and enlightened, strongly regulated capitalism.